So we're going to get into it now. I see we have a nice number here to get started. Parminder, we were talking about how excited we are, a little nervous on my end, having Parminder here and having the chat, but also really excited about what we're going to get into. And I know we're going to have a nice, deep and juicy conversation about reimagining Africa. For those of you that may not be completely familiar with Parminder and her work, I'm going to read out to you her bio really quickly so that you can see why I was a little nervous and also extremely excited about having this conversation. So today we're talking about reimagining Africa, specifically post-COVID, right? We've been seeing a lot about what needs to happen next with entrepreneurs and members of society. And so today we're quite honored to have Parminder here with us for us to delve into this conversation and understand what do we mean when we say reimagining Africa, right? And we're going to talk specifically to African entrepreneurs, but also to individuals living on the African continent. We're going to see what happens now, what happens next. How do we lobby? How do we leverage, and I love this, how do we leverage the power of the collective? How do we change our mindset? And a couple of you had shared some of your questions while you were registering to be a part of this session. And you had asked, I don't know how to do this. How do I actually identify opportunities in a post-COVID world? And that's some of the stuff that we're going to be talking about today. And to read her bio now. So Parminder has a professional career that spans 40 years, and she has dedicated herself to positively impacting and transforming lives through her work in philanthropy, entrepreneurship, film and television production, arts and culture, yay, and investment funding. She is an inspirational leader who has excelled in a variety of fields, highlighting passion, vision, integrity, tenacity, and curiosity as the qualities that lie at the heart of her achievements. She served as the CEO of the Tony Elumelu Foundation, Africa's leading philanthropic organization based in Lagos, Nigeria, from April 2014 to April 2019, so for 5 years. And she brought her unique mix of skills, talent, and imagination to design, develop, and launch one of the most ambitious entrepreneurship programs on the continent, the TEF Entrepreneurship Program. And those of us on the continent know about the TEF Entrepreneurship Program and just what it's done for young entrepreneurs on the continent. And under her 5-year leadership, the foundation has cemented its role as the principal advocate for African entrepreneurship, empowering thousands on their path to economic and social transformation. So that's quite the bio, Parminder. What does it feel like? I'm quite curious. What does it feel like when you hear that read out loud about yourself?
It's quite, firstly, it's a reminder of how old you are, that you're no longer. But it's interesting that age-wise, I'm very proud of my age. I'm not one of those women who hide. So I'm going to be 65 this year. But I think when you read it, you think, my gosh, because each phase of your life, and which is what we'll talk about, is a journey. And entrepreneurship is a journey. It's a life journey. If you decide to become an entrepreneur, or even if you remain an entrepreneur, within, it's a journey. It's a journey. And so it's nice to reflect back on that journey and then take the learnings from that journey to reflect forward. Yeah. I hope.
I'm sure that's what we're going to get out of today's session. But speaking of journeys, and Parminder, we've sort of briefly touched on this, well, not so briefly, but briefly touched on this when we were thinking about the conversation that we were going to have today. And I remember thinking to myself when we were talking about, okay, how do we leverage the power of the collective? How do we change our mindsets? And then thinking, okay, why? You know, because we've been talking about COVID-19 and what it's done across the world and even on the African continent, and what entrepreneurs have done. And we're going to listen from you exactly what you have seen in supporting young entrepreneurs and entrepreneurs in general. But I'm curious about why you're a successful Indian British philanthropist, producer, and such. And why reimagining Africa? I'm quite curious about that. And for those that are joining us from across the continent and across the world, for some of them, I'm sure that's the question. So Parminder, why? Why reimagining Africa?
The source of it, or the essence of it is in storytelling, is in terms of the African narrative. I was introduced to Africa and the African continent and its diversity through films, and not through films by European filmmakers, but I sought out African storytellers, Usman Sembène, Gaston Kobore, many filmmakers from literally North Africa, South Africa, East Africa, and West Africa. And that was my first introduction. And I remember in 1983, in 82, I programmed a festival of Black American cinema, Black American independent cinema. And that blew my mind. Like, wow, there were African American filmmakers. And in their stories, they were telling in those 80s that, their struggles and aspirations and hopes for them as a community and as storytellers, and the challenges that they experienced in terms of breaking down the barriers to enter the so-called film industry. And then the following year, I followed it up with a festival of Third Eye, London's Festival of Third World Cinema, and brought films from Africa, Asia, and Latin America together in one festival, because there was a uniformity. We were all products of colonization. Obviously in America, it was much more around slavery, but we were also, living outside of our cultures. We were living, I was born in India and I was living in Britain, and we were navigating what is our place in Britain? Yeah? How do we engage and reshape the society? So I think for me, it's a continuation of that in terms of the African continent, that yes, I discovered Africa through its extraordinary storytellers, whether they were musicians, poets, writers, or filmmakers. Yeah, that narrative often gets disrupted. Yeah, that because the resources, because of the institutions are not, I don't know, maybe, prevent those creativities to seep through in the West. Yeah, certainly that creativity is very much alive across the African continent. So, when COVID struck in April when I eventually came to terms with it on the 22nd of March, when, our Prime Minister said, okay, we're going in lockdown 23rd of March. I thought, wow, well, this is serious, right? And I sat in that moment thinking, my God, I spent 5 years investing resources, time, money, mentoring, in 9,000 plus African startups through the work of the foundation. They're going to go to the wall, yeah, because they were only just getting started, yeah. And I mean, that's what brought me to Bongo Hive, and we had a conversation and met your community in terms of the entrepreneurship support organizations. So I think why, and it was, and we can talk about what it is that I did in terms of launching this initiative, or a campaign really, support for African SMEs. So for me, it's really important that this is a pandemic that neither you nor I, and I'm much older than you are, ever imagined that we would be living through it in our lifetime. Huh?
Yeah.
You know, across the African continent, you lived through many, the HIV, the Ebola, and others. But this was, you know, this was dramatic. It was the entire world. You know, you and I could have conversations with people in China, Japan, in India, my daughter is Medellin, in Colombia, wherever, and across the African continent, my friends in Nigeria, in Zambia, in Zimbabwe, etc. You know, Kenya, a lot of, you know, people I've been talking to in Kenya and South Africa, we're having the same conversations, yeah?
Yeah.
You know, they're all kind of, I don't know, framed by this coronavirus, yeah?
Yeah.
And then, you know, and I got quite, but the conversations that I've had with my friends across the African continent have been one of hope rather than one of despair. And I really think we learned a lot of lessons, you know, whether we are SMEs, entrepreneurs, whether we are, I don't know, government, policymakers, whether we are international development agencies who think we have to save Africa. I think there's a lot of lessons that we've learned in the last 3 months. It's quite an intense, you know, learning. And now I think we have to reimagine how we apply them. And I think we do have to reimagine Africa and what the African continent could look like and be post as it emerges through this COVID. COVID-19 isn't disappearing for a while, yeah? Sorry, that was a long answer. Okay, I'm going to try and be, you know, short in my answers.
No, we're here to hear from you. And I think just for everybody to understand, so I have a couple of questions. And these are based off of the campaign that you've been running, right? So you get the news, the Prime Minister says, look, we're going into lockdown. But also because you've been working on the continent, you understand and have come to understand a lot of the very deep challenges and opportunities that exist on the continent, and not just in Nigeria, but across the continent, because that's how far the foundation's reach is, right? And I'm curious about the campaign, where that came from. So you get the news, and now what are your first thoughts? And through the campaign, what do you aim to do? And also what have your lessons been in this time? And maybe for contrast, because you said there've been conversations about hope and not despair when you've had conversations on the continent. And so if you think back to your 5 years at the foundation, and you compare that to your experiences with this campaign, what would you say the similarities or the differences are? And I think we've had this conversation about how there's quite a bit of a shock in as far as the impact of COVID-19 on the continent, the scale of the impact, and maybe not so much the scale, but not scale of the COVID-19 pandemic. But just what are your thoughts when you think back to your experiences at the foundation and then starting the campaign? And why do you think there's been so much hope when you've had these conversations?
Very good. Gosh, very rich question. I think, I mean, you know what, you have two options. One is do nothing. Yeah. So I could have sat in the comfort zone of my home and just read tons and tons of books. And, you know, I was planning to, you know, I had signed up to do a program on coaching because I really wanted to see if there's way. I realized that one of the things I noticed is that African entrepreneurs, and I want to use the coaching to work with African entrepreneurs and SMEs, that the entrepreneur is the most isolated, alone human being, man or a woman. And often, you know, they're very good at taking care of the welfare of everyone else but themselves. And I thought it'd be really good to get some of these tools around coaching and then use them to support, to be a coach for African, to apply it specifically for African SMEs. My other thing was that I really thought it was time that I wrote my Africa story.
Yeah.
A story that obviously is, people think of it as just the last 5 years, but clearly my connection and my relationship with Africa goes back much, much longer. I shared about certainly programming films from Africa for the UK, and I then took a bunch of films from Africa to India as part of their film festivals. But then I went to Africa again as a filmmaker and made films, actually produced films working with African directors. So there was quite a lot of, and different parts of Africa, from Angola, Mozambique, to Tunisia and Algeria, Burkina Faso, South Africa, Nigeria, Kenya, in fact, as well. So I had already had a sense of Africa, but from, telling stories and working with African talent, African writers, African directors, African technicians. So the idea that, Africa, none of this existed in Africa, I was really kind of debunking that with the films. And those films were being made and shown on British television and in film festivals. So when the COVID struck, it was either that I just, okay, let me write this book, let me train as a coach, but I couldn't do it because I saw that my own government in the UK and a lot of the European governments and the Americans were coming up with these billion-dollar stimulus packages. They were going to help the self-employed, the unemployed, the freelancers, the small SMEs, the micro businesses, the big businesses, and so it went on up the scales, yeah. And I waited to see where were the stimulus packages for African SMEs and the African, 80% of the African economy is the informal economy. It is the African economy, right? And you put them in lockdown, you take away their daily existence, yeah? You put SMEs in lockdown, as many of our, the farmer in Uganda, Joel, or Ade, who runs a food business in Nigeria, or what was it? Cabana, who makes bicycles out of bamboo bikes. I mean, there are many, many examples, right? They were all suddenly like, we have to stay at home. How am I going to pay my workers? How am I going to pay for the rental? How? And it became like, okay, if I don't have any money, I'm not capitalized by, people investing. I don't have time to go out there and raise money. But what I have is a huge network, sort of very high level people, as well as massive amounts of a very vast network of African SMEs. I have a network, I have knowledge and information, and I have ways of getting hold of that knowledge and information. So it was literally, what can I do with doesn't require. And so I phoned about half a dozen people that I know in Nigeria. I called my friend, in fact, Samba in Zambia. I called some friends in Kenya, and I said, what do you think? And they said, yes, no, do it. Whatever you can do, if you can gather information and resources and share them with the African SMEs. And it was literally, it's a bunch of volunteers that came together, to share those stories of hope, innovation, and resilience, which is what we've done. We crowdsourced a lot of in-kind resources, funding opportunities like Jack Ma Foundation had his, the Africa Business Heroes competition. Amazingly, it wasn't going to cancel it for 2020. And so we said we would promote it to Smart Africa got in touch from Rwanda and said they're also looking, they've got a proposal around how to use technology in this, COVID for health. So we started literally sharing that, yeah. But also looking at, markets, because a lot of people had goods that they were trying to sell or to buy, but, putting digital market providers, I suppose, or platforms in touch. And then also began to look at how do we advocate for African SMEs to governments and policymakers and the donor agencies, because it was also becoming very clear, yes, this is a health pandemic, but actually right behind it or besides it is an economic pandemic, yeah?
Yeah.
And so that was the stimulus, and it's been a 3 intense months, you know, so that the volunteer team and myself, and they're extraordinary because they're actually students, all the support people, you know, like the lady who does our graphics is a medical student. Desmond, who produces the videos, is also a med student. Lucci, who writes, is also a med student, actually. Felix, who does all the social media, he is a dentist student, right? Victoria is passionate about farmers and agribusinesses. Loves, supports entrepreneurship and also worked with me. So, you know, people, everyone, and I said, why are you doing this? He said, because African SMEs matter. And we will one day be SMEs, whether we're going to work in the health sector or whether we're whichever sector we are. So maybe I can share, I mean, so that's how it started. And then, you know, I think very quickly within middle of April, or, you know, we launched it on the 1st of April, it also was like, hang on, there's no one. So I was also beginning to hear stories, you know, and they were all European Western stories of my stories, lockdown, my, you know, how am I coping, how am I doing? And they were all very, I don't know, privilege, stories from privilege, right? But they weren't like African SME stories. So I said, you know what, let's shine, let's showcase or promote or spotlight some of those African SMEs and let them tell the world how they are innovating, coping, surviving, you know, rising to the challenges. And so we launched the African SME stories. And it was amazing because it's amazing how much you can do, right? Like you and I having this conversation where there's a whole bunch of people who are listening to us. We literally leveraged the Instagram Live, the Facebook Live, as we're doing now, LinkedIn for, you know, really thought provoking articles. What else did we do? Obviously email and YouTube. And we were, you know, I mean, it started off as a hashtag and we started using my own social media handles. But now the organized, this campaign has its own amazing social media following. But the one that really inspired, we continue with our SME stories. But what was also brilliant was to start really almost like, I mean, that's one of the things I want to talk to you guys and give feedback to Bongo Hive, because while researching for this, sorry, I'm diverting, while researching for, you know, I went on the Bongo Hive and said, oh, let me have a look at their webinars. And there's an extraordinary amount of information. I mean, you know, notes about a new paradigm for the Zambian entrepreneur, the digital is the new normal. You know, you got webinars on regulatory navigation, business planning, remote work, mental health, staff productivity, finance. I mean, I just thought this is a university in entrepreneurship, right? And then I looked at the number of people who are actually viewing your YouTube channels.
Yes.
Numbers are dismal, right? Because you know, because there's no, I'm not saying you do PR and marketing, but you have extraordinary content, Bongo. And I'm sure people who are listening to me will have enormous amount of content, yeah? You know, it's not like they need to go to places to get the answers. They have the answers at their fingertip. And your generation have them at the touch of a button. But you know, it's about content marketing. It's marketing that content so the widest possible people can actually engage with it through the different platforms. Yeah. And so that's what we've done. So we would do an Instagram live interview with a farmer, as we did with Joe Cherub. Someone would transcribe that conversation and edit a really beautiful piece highlighting the key highlights from that conversation, right? So that would be put out on LinkedIn, yeah. Very different medium, yeah. We would then edit clips from it, 1-minute clips from that conversation to promote Joel's, that particular story, then directing them to our YouTube, sorry, I'm getting my social media platforms muddled up because I was born, thankfully, in the analog age, where we didn't read books, we had to read papers. But you can direct that 1-minute clip to say, here, if you really want to hear the full story, you can watch it, you can read it, yeah. And so I was thinking, wow, these guys have so much content there. And that's what we, so the the farmer story is just so much so this extraordinary photographer, well-known Shola, amazing photographer, reached out to us and said, I want to go and meet the can I go meet African farmers during lockdown in Nigeria, right? And he did. And one of the stories that he exposed was that there was a whole bunch of thousands of pigs dying of swine fever that nobody had seen or heard about. Why? Because we were all in lockdown. And they died because the farmers were in lockdown, yeah? And so that then led us to, we did that for about 6 weeks, I think. Every week we did interview 2 farmers every week, while another person, Linda, was interviewing African SMEs, and we're going to start publishing those stories. But then Victoria, crazy, amazing Victoria that she is, full of ideas, said, let's convene a conference. I said, are you mad? Lockdown. And she said, you can do it digitally. And I said, oh, okay, do you think really you can get the speakers? I mean, she put together the most amazing panel, which we held on the 17th of June, but not, we haven't stopped with that. So now we have, and in fact, when we finish this, this amazing conversation, I want to share with you the report that emerged from that conversation with funders, farmers, digital market people, and who else are they? Funders, farmers, policymakers, sorry, yeah. So it was a beginning of a conversation which is for me, a conversation about reimagining Africa. And I will share with you some other ideas that we have. I think the campaign, I think it's going to continue. I keep saying at the end of every month, I think we should stop it. We can't go on, I don't know, exploiting ourselves and, and our good-heartedness. But I think for as long as people want to continue, we will continue with the campaign. So.
Thank you, Parminder. Thank you for sharing on the campaign. And I'm looking forward to seeing the report on all the work that you've been doing. And you've talked about advocacy, right? The role that plays specifically for the African entrepreneur. And I really love how you talked about, when describing the African entrepreneur, or the entrepreneur in general, you said how they're the most isolated individual. And it's interesting because we were looking at insights for the Pan-African Digital Assembly that I believe that you were a part of as well. And just looking at what entrepreneurs across the continent were saying, and one of them had to do with the culture around entrepreneurship and support, right? Do they have support? Do they not? What do people think about the entrepreneur and such? So it's interesting because isolation was one of those things that came out in as far as the entrepreneur's experience in building their businesses and so on. But as we go into reimagining Africa and what role several players in the entrepreneurship ecosystem play, I'm curious about, we started talking about the role of government, and I think I'll start there. You had said in our chats before this session, just the role that governments have already been playing. And I think this is quite pertinent because I know I know across the continent, generally, and across the world, if we see what's going on across the world, there's generally this sense of, I want to use resentment, or a bit of people feeling fed up or feeling like they're not being heard, and so therefore they just stay away from engaging with government or people and individuals in power. But you're saying that we have to learn how to lobby, right? We have to learn how to bring people to the table and have this conversation. And you were sharing how African governments in particular have played quite an integral role, especially in times of the pandemic, right? While we've been struck by COVID. And I wanted, for the sake of everybody on this call, for you to share some of your thoughts and insights on that, why you're asking us to lobby and learn how to lobby as entrepreneurs, as people in society, and what you've seen in terms of government and entrepreneurs.
I think it was, coronavirus is a wake-up call, right? For everyone around the world, but I think particularly so for the African continent. There's never going to be business as normal. There can never be. And I think for me, as we started to, as the campaign launched, one of the first things I did was to look at, so what is the African government? What are the political leaders doing across Africa? And to my amazement, there was this extraordinary op-ed from the Ethiopian Prime Minister, which was published, I think, in the Financial Times. I read it and I thought, okay, he's saying, we need to do things ourselves, but at the same time, what he was doing was, saying to IMF, the World Bank, all the multilateral donor agencies, get off our back in terms of debt, We're looking for debt relief and looking for stimulus packages from them that they could then deploy for their own people, The Rwandan president, why are we asking for things when we're asking for things we already have, right? And his focus was on mindset shift, Yes, we don't need to be always asking the West. Let's try and find the solutions from within. The South African, government was the one that came up with the largest and the biggest and, hugest stimulus package. I think it was like 500 billion rand or something, which is 7 to 10% of the country's GDP. Ghana did the same. Nigeria was floundering, but a lot of people were helping it to get itself organized. I think Zambia also came up with some stimulus packages. The reality was that all of those governments, and then I read an op-ed from the president of the Africa Development Bank, So I began to share all of this because I come from an industry where we follow the money, right? As a filmmaker, you follow the money. Where there is money, and money isn't just capital, but where are there incentives, tax breaks, etc. Hollywood doesn't go to Hungary because it wants to make films in Hungary. It's because Hungary is, we will give you 40% tax break. So they will come and shoot a film. You don't go to South Africa because all your films are going to be set in South Africa, having negotiated a co-production treaty with South Africa. But a lot of the films can be shot there and you can make, I don't know, Joburg, Cape Town, whatever, made to look like New York or somewhere else, right? Why leveraging the incentives, So it was like, hang on, you know what? All African SMEs, don't be, a lot of them were like literally, that thing about the rabbit caught in the headlights, They're like, what is happening, in a state of shock. And then they began, some of them, and like Ada in Nigeria, began to organize, and they suddenly recognized that as SMEs, as individuals, they had no voice. They couldn't, right? in my, in my industry in the UK, in my industry that I spent 20 plus years working in, which is film and television industry, I was a member of the Producers Association. And the Producers Association here in the UK recognized, yes, the government had taken care of the businesses, i.e. the small businesses, the creative businesses, but a large chunk of our sector is freelance, right? And it hadn't taken that into account. So they literally organized and created a £1 million fund for freelancers, lobbied the UK government to now also include freelancers in their stimulus packages. The same was done for the arts. You remember the theaters here, the performing arts, the music, all of those venues, yeah? That was not happening because the associations that do exist of SMEs across the African continent were not operating, were not being, they didn't seem to have a purpose. Well, now they have a purpose, because it's through those organizations, it's through those coalitions and networks and organization that SMEs are going to have to make demands, and with those organizations to begin to engage with their government. Until now, the SMEs, quite rightly, you know what, if I can sell my product or service and I have a customer paying for it, I don't need to work with the government. Well, I'm not, I think one of the things that African SMEs have to wake up to is that you need to prepare for a more active government role in the economies of your countries and societies, right? We have seen how well many of them, in fact, without exception of the 54 African countries, how well the political leaders have responded to this, yeah? But climbing out of this, hole is a long road, right? And they are going to need every skill available to them within their own countries, within their own national boundaries. And I fundamentally believe that it's the African SMEs who will rise to that challenge, who will come forward as problem solvers, yeah? Who will say, no, do not outsource the manufacturing of face masks and protective clothing in hospitals to China. Build a manufacturing hub in Africa, yeah? Do not outsource the digital transformation of the African continent or your own country. Look at the extraordinary skills base that you have in software developers and hardware developers in the continent, yeah? So across the healthcare, in education, in agriculture, in manufacturing, in financial services, all of the sectors that are about to really take off post-COVID, the African SMEs must be center stage, must be center stage. And in order for you to do that, you have to run your business. I agree. I ran my own production company, but I was also very active in my organization. The membership, the organization that through which, whether it was the Producers Association, there was also the Women in Film and Television Association, because that's the sector I worked in. I was very active in those organizations to make sure that our voices as a sector were being represented through this organization to the government, to the policymakers. And that's what I find really exciting. You can empower 10,000 entrepreneurs, but if none of them have the power to co-create and change policy, develop strategies, come with solutions, and where they don't have a place at the table of in government, governments will set up task forces, right? They can't set up task forces now going forward without the presence of African SMEs. I could go
absolutely.
I'm so powerful, right? But I mean,
Love that. I really feel, just sort of going back to some of the nuggets that you've shared while you were speaking, is just the role having African entrepreneurs be center stage. And you touched on the way that, and we see this, and have these conversations even as Bongo Hive, internally and externally. This, for economic development to happen, we have to rely on private sector. But the realization and the fact you're saying, look, COVID has been a wake-up call, because this is not just a health pandemic, it's an economic pandemic. And the people that make things happen, that generate an income for the nation, are the SMEs, are the business people, the entrepreneurs. And so they cannot not be at the table, right? But also, this is something, when you were speaking, it reminded me of some of the work that we do, all of the work that we do as Bongo Hive, and constantly having conversations on co-creation and collaboration, and saying how for innovation to occur anywhere at any level, you cannot operate in silos. And that extends not just to entrepreneurs as a team and so on, but even the relationship between entrepreneurs and public sector. So I absolutely love that. At this point, I'm going to pause and just ask everybody that's joining us, that's still here with us, to share in the chat section with us, what are your thoughts on this, on lobbying government? What have some of your experiences been? I know that we have here with us, whether Facebook Live or here on Zoom, individuals that have started businesses. What are your thoughts on lobbying government and that being the norm going forward? And on top of this, what about collaborating as entrepreneurs? What have some of your experiences been? So like Parminder was sharing, she's part of associations and things like that. So as entrepreneurs, I'm curious, are you part of associations? What are your thoughts on lobbying and having conversations with government, having a seat at the table? Please share in the chat section. If you're joining us via Facebook Live, you can do that in the comment section, and they'll be shared with us.
Can I just, I feel like, rather than being very general, let me just bring it down to some very specifics in terms of the role of the government. I think number one, the government must not waste this crisis.
Yes.
This crisis is an opportunity right across the 54 African countries. I think they can begin to retailer their guarantee schemes to meet the needs of the informal and the formalized SMEs. Yeah, which is, and it's not one size fits all. Yeah, I think it's about taking a flexible approach to those who lack credit. I mean, a lot of the SMEs is like, you're asking, you want to be, okay, go. You want to be an entrepreneur, you want to be an SME, but you will not get balloons tied to your ankles and you'll be made to climb Everest, right? With all of those constraints. I think particularly post-COVID, I think the African governments, and if they are getting all of this extraordinary money from, whether international donor agencies or whether they are finding, SMEs and everyone, a budget is a moral document. Yeah? And SMEs, you need to hold our governments, your governments and our governments, we need to hold them accountable. And that they do need to unbundle those crazy procurement procedures, right? And start to onboard SMEs, yeah? Just as you in Bongo Hive, you don't, entrepreneurs don't arrive in your vicinity, in your organization, fully baked, do they?
Yeah.
Your job is to develop them, to grow them, which is what you do. Well, similarly with government, when SMEs come to you because they think in that procurement, in that value chain, supply chain, they can bring value add, your job is to listen and your job is to help and develop them to the point where they're able to secure that, yeah? I think it's really, really important. One of the things that became really apparent was the lack of data. Certainly the SMEs, a lot of the African governments who had the stimulus packages is like, well, where are the SMEs? Who do
Yes.
right? Well, if they're registered on your, you have SME registrations, right? There's a large percentage of those who are in the informal sector. Your job, government, is to begin to incentivize the formalization and the registration of SMEs.
Yes.
You have data at your fingertips, yeah? I think it's really important. This for me is the biggest one. There is no reason why Africa imports so much nonsense, from second-hand clothes to second-hand car parts to second-hand cars to second-hand motorbikes. Why it then also allows capital flight in terms of, supporting the education systems in America, UK, Europe, the health systems in now the Middle East, also India, and before that it was UK, Europe, right? I mean, you get sick, those who can afford it jump on a plane. Well, the reality is you were not able to jump on the plane. You had to be taken care of by African doctors and nurses, right?
Yes.
And
Yes.
what to my amazement, not so many have not died, right? When you look at it, the statistics in America. So I think you've got to reshape manufacturing with a focus on self-reliance. There is no reason. And if you can bring all that supply chain and back to Africa, African SMEs will create jobs. They will generate revenues. They will generate wealth. They will stabilize their communities. They will stabilize their families. They will stabilize their cities and their nations, right? But if you go on importing and not exporting anything that the SMEs are making,
Yes.
Africa is dependent. I mean, what has this revealed is over dependence, over outsourcing of everything young Africans can do at home, right?
Yes.
I think in terms of, okay, here's the big one, which is,
Yes.
I think Bongo Hive is an example of that a lot of your funding will come from international sources, right? That is for a lot of the ESO, the entrepreneurship support organizations, that dependency on foundations, donor agencies that are based in UK, Europe, US, possibly China, etc. Yeah, I think there is no shortage of millionaires, billionaires, trillionaires across the African continent, right? They have made a lot of money, whether it's the telcos, whether it's in, through oil or, the commodities or the natural resources or in the new technologies. There is a lot of wealth. I always use this entrepreneurs. It's not that there's a shortage of capital across the continent, right? And so the African governments and I think the SMEs have to really join in that, which is to literally incentivize domestic investment. Tony Elumelu is a classic case in point. Strives is another one. You can count them on one hand. Mo Abraham is another. Dangote is another, right?
Yes.
So you can you come up with the Zambian, philanthropists who are also. Yes, philanthropy. That's about taking a business approach to investing in catalyzing the African entrepreneurship ecosystem. But it's also investment, direct investment, yeah, i.e. African domestic investment, investing in the next generation of African products and services developed by African SMEs. African governments must invest in research and development. In terms of digital, there's a lot that the only African governments can do, and that's why it becomes even more important now going forward that the African SMEs organize and make those demands. The digital infrastructure. Bongo Hive, you can only do so much, but if you don't have the digital infrastructure on which your amazing software developers can play and create, we're not going anywhere, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
The government has to build that infrastructure, whether it's the technological infrastructure, whether it's the roads, whether it's the, power, yeah.
Mm-hmm. So that's a good one.
Much affected by it. But, the infrastructure projects that work in the interest of SMEs. So
Mm-hmm.
the disconnect in the past, which is, it was either big business and government talking to each other, and SMEs
Mm-hmm.
for the crumbs to fall off the table, and then they would pick one or two and go off. Well, those
Yeah.
days are gone, right?
Yeah.
The SME has to be part of that conversation.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to read a couple of thoughts we have here for you. And so Dora, and I noted this as well, Dora is sharing how I think that she loved what you mentioned about how a budget is a moral document. So she puts that along at the heart. Thank you, Dora. Mwewa says, I definitely agree that entrepreneurs need to have a seat at the table to influence policies being made. Africans post-COVID need to get used to being political entrepreneurs if we want to see any development. The informal sector have the solutions to most of the challenges governments are faced with. And Tafatwa says, I believe, and this is a call to action for ESOs like Bongo Hive, but Tafatwa says, I believe organizations like Bongo help us SMEs lobby in government as they have a more pronounced voice. And just on to Fadzwa's point, I would like to talk about how everything is interconnected. All right, and just going back to co-creation and collaboration. And you said, you talked about some of the role that ESOs and in Zambia and in the region, the role that, say, Bongo Hive would play in as far as supporting this and lobbying government to make these things happen. And you shared some of the points that governments have to do. Is there anything you would like to add in as far as ESOs and what role we play, as well as any other active players? Who else is involved in making sure that this happens and supporting entrepreneurs and SMEs to lobby?
So it's not, it's very easy to get, government isn't, it's not a blob. Government is very multi-department, multi-layered, yeah? I think, that, okay, so I'm going to be provocative and say, I think there's a danger that African SMEs can become lazy, right? You know what, I'll just let Bongo Hive do this, yeah? But, actually Bongo Hive has its own challenges in terms of its own survival, yeah? And actually, Bongo Hive does need to be working in partnership with the entrepreneurs, with the SMEs. We call them entrepreneurs, SMEs, yeah? But it's also working in partnership with, it has the ability to convene. It's using our convening power, right? At one level, you could say Bongo Hive has the convening power and leveraging your convening power to convene the academic institution, to convene, key players in key departments in the government, right? It's not sort of one fits all. If you're going to be, one campaign is like we've done with the farmers, is focused on farmers' stories, right? Or another could be on the health workers, yeah? Health department, in the education, in the manufacturing, in trade, and, so you go around, so Bongo Hive does, organizations like Bongo Hive can and must begin to use its convening power in relation to, as I said, the academic institution, the wider ecosystem. It is the entrepreneurship starts at school and university, and then you come out, I hope, yeah? It's, the governments right across, the policymakers, the ministers and the policymakers, having relationship with the bureaucrats who run government and the ministers and the politicians that we elect, yeah?
Yeah.
I think it's really important to also use your convening power to educate, inform, and change the mindsets of the DFIs, the development agencies, the multilateral donor agencies. Yeah, I mean, it was fantastic that is it the Africa Union that commissioned, or no, it appointed 4 envoys at the start of this coronavirus, right? And if you look at all of, they're amazing people, Ngozi and, you know, the guy who ran the bank and before that insurance. But, you know, there were 4 to 1 man, I mean, 3 men, 1 woman, I can't, but there's not a single person representing the SME's voice, right? They were all big business or big government, right? That cannot be the norm anymore, yeah? So I think it's about, and not waiting for politicians and policymakers to convene those. You know, I for Policy is an example of that, yeah? Where it says, okay, we'll get the innovation hub, the community innovation hubs to be the conveners of those voices. And out of that emerges a co-created policy, whatever the policy is for, yeah? I think, you know, we have to, I mean, for me, that was one of the extraordinary discoveries through this lockdown period, was to meet the founder of John Stewart of I for Policy, and to learn how his approach and his methodology. I said, oh my God, you know, absolutely, that it, you know, about co-creating policy. So Bongo Hive, Angozas, TBNs, the, you know, hub for women in Kenya. I mean, you know, the innovation hub in, I don't know, Botswana, you know, all of these entrepreneurship support organization, you do have the power. You need to begin to say, yes, we run an organization which provides X, Y, and Z products and services. But I believe that in the period of post-COVID, you also have to take on another role, which is we will convene those conversations, yeah? That allows SMEs, that allows the informal sector. Because post-COVID, the informal sector and the importance of formalizing it from an African economic point of view is going to become very, very important. And, you know, you guys are, organizations like you are based in the community. You're not in Brussels, you're not in Geneva, you're not in New York, right? Where these guys sit and talk about what they think Africa needs. You know what it needs, or what they think African SMEs need. You know what they need, yeah? I mean, I think one of the privilege of, you know, I mean, when I was invited by Mr. Olumalu to come and help operationalize his vision, I think, you know, I'm so grateful for 5 years of that opportunity, because it meant that I actually traveled literally around 50 of the 54 African countries. And then there was no one in between me and the entrepreneur and the SME, that I could talk directly to them, that I wasn't, you know, sitting in the Africa Development Bank where I passed on my money to someone else who passed it to someone else, who passed it to someone else. And eventually, you know, the person or the organization that it was meant to empower got a tiny slice of that. Yeah? That has to fundamentally change.
I agree. And I just want to say at this point, thank you so much, everybody, for sharing your thoughts. And we'll get into some of the questions you have soon as we go into the last half of an hour we have with Parminder. And
I'm going to ask you questions now. No, Sakai, look at you. You know, you're an extraordinary artist. You're a, you know, award-winning fashion designer. You run what, you know, so what do you think needs to happen? And what's your role in making that happen?
I think a lot of what you've been saying is what needs to happen. And I think that for a bit of context, when I started out in in fashion, I was still in university. So like you were saying earlier, a lot of businesses start while people are in school or university. And it was born out of a hobby. And I think at that point, it was really about, yes, we're solving a problem in as far as wanting for the world to see and to change the narrative about what African fashion looks like, African art and things like that. But over the years, and it's been a lot of learning on the job or learning as we go, it was something more needs to happen. And we're telling the stories, but it seems like we're speaking in a vacuum. And I think that we do have to learn about how do we lobby. And I loved it when we first had the conversation about what needs to happen. And you were saying we have to learn how to lobby. We have to learn how to have this conversation. So I do agree with that. And I think it's been interesting to be on the entrepreneur side or the SME side, and then to shift gears and join Bongo Hive and be part of this movement of growing entrepreneurs on the continent. So I do believe it's a lot to do, coming from a sort of creative background. I strongly believe in the power of storytelling, right? And that plays into lobbying. How do entrepreneurs tell their story? How do they speak to their customers on one level, but how do you take that up a notch and take a seat at the table and say, these are the problems we are having, and this is where you can come in? So I find that my question becomes, as entrepreneurs, do we understand what our problems are? Do we understand what we want and exactly what we need government to do? And so those are some of the questions that I'm having, and the experiences with Bongo Hive being a part of I4 policy and all of the work with entrepreneurs slowly answers that question. So those are some.
It's fascinating that you think of creativity and entrepreneurship as being different.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, so for me, one of the things, and I'm sure you've seen it too, you know,
Yes.
fashion, music, film, theatre, the performing arts, you know, in the UK, there are 13 subsectors that, you know, are part of the creative industries, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know, in, you know, Nollywood coming out of Nigeria has 600 million people who watch that content, right? Some
Yes.
amazingly good, some amazingly bad, right? You know, the Nigerian film and music talent. I mean, I remember driving in the capital of Botswana, and the music coming out of the guy's car was Nigerian.
Mm-hmm.
This is Nigerian. I mean, by then I knew I could make a distinction, right? And he said, "How do you know?" And I said, "Well, where do you think I've just come from?" But anyway, I said, "But what about, you know, your local?" He said, "No, we only listen to Nigerian music. It's just brilliant. It's just amazing." You know, so one of the things that I've, as a creative entrepreneur, creative who's worked in the industries, and particularly as a creative entrepreneur of color, or, you know, Black entrepreneur, those of us who are African, Asian, you know, working in the creative industries, we think we only focus on the creative, which is this amazing fashion that you've designed or this piece of art, but actually not the business of creativity.
Yes.
So I hope that as part of your, the work that you're doing and you're learning is how that if you have that creative passion, how do you monetize that? Whether you're painting,
Exactly.
whether you're making music. And I think, you know, we talk about post-COVID, now, you know, the sector that's going to be the most, has been already hit in the most devastating way is obviously the media, the creative industries. Yeah? They can't go out and start shooting movies, or theaters are not opening, cinemas are not opening. The weddings and the, you know, Zambian weddings, I'm sure, are just like Indian and Nigerian, where 3,000 people show up, right? You know, the entertainment for that, the music for that, yeah. Yes, you can go and continue recording music in the studios, I suppose, and you can, you know, print a lot of CDs, but you know, I really, you know, I feel you know, that if I was starting a lobbying if there's a sector that really needs to organize itself in the way that we've done here, the freelancers in the UK, it is the creative industries, creative, the performing industries sector across the African continent. You know, imagine showing up to a wedding tomorrow and there's not a musician, right? Or there's not a, you know, I mean, you can't imagine societies without the artists, without people like yourself. And, you know, and I really, I mean, one of, you know, maybe as the next, you know, so we've done a focus for 8 weeks on African farmers. I think we will continue that. But I really think the next thing that the campaign should take up is giving a voice to the African creative industries. Yeah. Because I feel the health sector is well catered for, right? You know, I mean, everybody thinks that now it's like everybody woke up to the importance of health, I suppose. Education is important. Even the creative industries are like the farmers. If you don't have food, you can't live. You don't, you know, for me, creative industries is also about your spiritual well-being, your emotional well-being. Your soul is nurtured by creativity, and if that is not, you know, post-COVID, and certainly the governments, you know, must find ways of now, supporting. And if there's one sector that must learn to lobby, it is the African creative sector.
Definitely. And I want it, we really must. And in terms of now going into, and I'm sure a lot of you came onto the call, like we're going to know exactly what the opportunities are, right? And Parminder is going to share with us, these are the opportunities that exist. And so Parminder, before we go into, so the following questions that I have for you are, what are the opportunities and how do we identify them and harness these before we then go into a bit of question and answer? And some of you have already shared your questions. If you haven't, please put those down in the Q&A section if you're joining us here on Zoom. If you're joining us via Facebook Live, please make sure you put down your comments and your questions for Parminder in the comment section, and we'll get to those shortly. But in terms of identifying opportunities, so one of them is what you've already shared, right? The lobbying and learning how to lobby and learning how to come together as entrepreneurs and say, this is our voice. We have one united voice, and this is what we need for you to do as government, right? Or to the powers that be. What other opportunities exist for the African entrepreneur post-COVID? And how do they identify those opportunities? And how do they harness those?
I think, you know, the lobbying is much more about, you know, speaking with one voice, yeah? You know, we talked about the isolated SME, the isolated entrepreneur. I think, and the role of the entrepreneurship support organizations like Bongo Hive and others is in enabling that, as well as obviously doing all their day job and the things that they're set up to do. But I think they need to extend. You gave it another term, which is, you know, political, what was it you said? To become political entrepreneurs, I think was, political entrepreneurs. I think it's about embracing, you know, whether you want to call yourself a political entrepreneur, but you cannot ignore the fact that the government is an important player in the ecosystem in which you want to operate, Whether you're an SME with a product or a service, or whether you're an entrepreneurship support organization with services for those entrepreneurs. I think the other is, you know, is really as the entrepreneur, as SMEs, then, you know, the economic landscape has changed. You know, a lot of SMEs will have died. Yeah, a lot of them will have stopped functioning as businesses. Yeah, but that's not to say that they won't emerge because they've seen another gap in the market. Yeah, entrepreneurs, what are we? We see a gap in the market. We think we've got a unique solution to that gap in the market. We develop a product or a service around it, and then we put everything in engaging the customer who will then pay for our product or service. Yeah, we are problem solvers. I don't think you have to leave this planet Earth now to know that there are even bigger, more urgent problems that need solving. Yeah, I think in terms of the sectors, there is a real kind of a realigning. I remember when, throughout my 5 years of the applications that we've received in the foundation, the agriculture was always the largest, right? Whether they were tech-enabled or whether they were, offline agri-businesses, yeah? It was always the largest number of applicants from 21 to 37 years old. So you know that the young people were beginning to embrace agriculture. But during COVID, we've seen how that supply chain, the food supply chain, has also been totally broken. You've heard of stories about, the pigs dying on the farm because the farmers were not able to get to it. Tomatoes going to waste because the farmer hasn't been able to get to it to take it. I heard stories about area boys and, holding, farmers as they're trying to take their goods to the market and, wanting money in order to pass from A to B to C. They're crossing lines and borders, right? I think so agriculture, absolutely, and fixing that supply chain there are, it's a film. The film starts with an idea and ends up on a screen, right? And there's a whole process in between, and there's a whole load of players who play in that, yeah, including you as a fashion designer or as an artist, right? Similarly, that supply chain, the agricultural supply chain, there's a huge amounts of opportunities for African SMEs. So I would say the agriculture, massive opportunity. Education. I mean, I know, I've met a lot of online education providers across the African continent, but I think they came into their own during COVID, obviously. So the thing is not to now vacate that space, but to really consolidate that space, yeah, in terms of education. That no, there is going to be a different way of learning, right? And, again, I think Africans, because you guys, it's about leapfrogging technology, you really are ahead of the technological curve, whether it's mobile or not, yeah? I think there's a huge opportunity for you to, in the way that, I mean, there are many, many innovations that have come out of Africa around mobile technology. Similarly, I think around online and education. Manufacturing, totally and utterly. Never, ever, ever should you have to buy sanitizers from China. Never, ever, right? It should all be. Never do you need to go and literally buy clothes, ready-made t-shirts or whatever that you can sell across the African. I think the traders have a place, but African SMEs need to go beyond that. Yeah? That actually manufacturing and not just high-end fashion, which is what I'm sure you did, but actually everyday clothes. Yeah. I was blown away when I heard in Nigeria that all the wedding clothes, that the bride and the groom sides all look alike. I mean, beautifully tailored, beautifully sequenced. I thought, wow, who makes these? Where do you get this? Where do you get them stitched and sequenced? She said, oh, we go to Mumbai. Can you imagine? Nigerian nairas are sustaining an entire cottage industry somewhere in Mumbai where these women are, literally stitching material with amazing beads and stuff, which are then brought back to Lagos and turned into. Anyway, manufacturing is massive, massive opportunity. Health I don't need to say that. I'm one of the, when I asked Nigerians, when you ask them, even you, what was your degree before? I didn't make a note of it and I've lost it. What did
Economics and finance.
You're an economist, right? Yeah. So you're just like an Indian or any other, which is, so the Indians, it was like you're either an accountant, you're an engineer, you're a lawyer, of course. I can't remember. I think those were the main, yeah? And entrepreneur, no, absolutely not. Until 10, 15 years ago, entrepreneur was like, that's the craziest thing you can think about. And I remember when I was setting out, I trained as a teacher, but I know my parents just couldn't get their head around, oh, you work in television. What do you do in television? Oh, I'm working. It was only when I joined the BBC, they could just get it. Oh, she works in the BBC. What she does in the BBC, they couldn't get. But I'm saying that for me, in terms of the health sector, it's massive opportunity, massive opportunity. Online, offline, Nigerians and across the African continent, health. Well, I mean, I don't think the governments or civil society or anybody needs another wake-up call to the one that we've all received in terms of our health infrastructures, yeah? I think digital transformation, all of this is being underpinned by digital transformation. Bongo Hive, you should be soaring by now, right? Because you are in the forefront of that digitization of everything, to digitize government, to digitize health, digitize education, digitize food, everything. You are producing the next generation of those software developers who can do that from across the African continent, yeah? And I think now is the time, it's about seizing the time, isn't it, yeah? Now is the time for organizations like yourself. And I might, think to your organizations like yourself is don't try and do it alone. Now is the time to form coalitions and collaborations, yeah? Pitch for things jointly from the government or from the international development agencies, right? No longer be in a room and having a conversation with the GIZ, a DFID, though I think that's being changed, or the European funds or whatever. Share information, collaborate, take 4 other organizations into those meetings with you and say, we're going to be putting in, we're here together and we are now, this is our proposal to digitize or, to whatever the project is, yeah? I think, I mean, I just think there is a strength in that collective action. I think a lot of ESOs, the entrepreneurship support organizations, will be forced into those kinds of merger conversations or those kinds of, primarily merger conversations. It's either continuing small because it's a lifestyle or actually, merging your resources to find a much bigger strength and I guess a bigger purpose as well. Does that answer?
It does. It does. And I saw Susanna, you said, how do we conduct?
Industries, yeah.
So we have 7 minutes to go before we close.
Oh my gosh.
So Susanna, I hope that answers your question. Parminder, we have about 6 questions here. Some of them I'll answer and some of them you will. So we need to try and be, it's always such a pleasure speaking to you, and it tends to feel like let's just keep talking. So we have a task at hand. We have to try and finish this at least in the next 5 minutes and answer these questions that come in. We have a question that came via Facebook, so I'm looking specifically at the Q&A section So like I asked, if you had a question, you post that in the Q&A section. So we have a question here from Facebook, and this is from Sikana Andrew Sumbwa, saying, just thinking, talking about startups as the programs aim to help young entrepreneurs through the process of making their startups operational, as in teaching them, say, how to market their products, ensure they add value to their products, ensure they have books of accounts, etc. What exactly do you do? Andrew, if you're still there, I will ask that you just rephrase this for us to let us know if you're asking Bongo Hive or Parminder. As Bongo Hive, we do run programs that ensure that you're thinking through all of this. So we have a team of experts and we work with members of our community and so on to really help SMEs think about these things, to think about what's going on around them, how to identify those challenges, and then set up the structures and processes that they need to for their businesses. So, but you will need to let us know if that answers your question. And Nathan asked, very interesting comments, and this is at the beginning, very interesting comments on the vast amounts of content available on Bongo Hive. Are there any analytics available on the reach of this content to people all over Africa? I'm not sure if we have our M&E team here, but I will say that with our content over time, we have reached somewhere between 25,000 and 45,000 people with our content, and this is across the continent. So thank you for that question, Nathan. And then we have also another question from Linda here from Facebook, and this is Nsa Pico Hachimbi, who says, for sure, COVID has brought about a paradigm shift in the way businesses operate. Post-COVID, I feel SMEs and even big businesses need more knowledge on how to sustain and maintain a business during a crisis. Businesses need to be molded in such a way as to adapt and even defy consequences of a crisis such as COVID. We need to train businesses on how to survive every sour circumstance with minimal injuries, with as minimal injuries as possible. Do you have anything to add to Pico's comment?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the areas we didn't focus on, we focused a lot on government, a lot on SME, small, medium enterprises. We haven't focused on the high growth, but absolutely we didn't focus on the corporate and the big business. You know, again, I mean, I guess I'm coming at all of this from the POV, the point of view of an SME, yeah? You know, I don't need to feel sorry for the corporates or the large business, right? They know how to lobby, they know how to get what they want from government, from the multilateral donor agencies, from anybody and everybody, yeah? They know how to squeeze their customers, right? They know, and they will adapt very, very quickly, as all of them, you know, Twitter is now saying, please don't bother to come to work. You know, you guys can all work from home, right? You will remain at home, yeah? How quickly they've adapted, yeah? How nimble, and some of them are very nimble, others are very much a Titanic going in one direction and not changing. I think for me, the role of African SMEs is to also send a wake-up call to the corporates, to the African corporates, right? And the African big businesses, yeah? It's not business as usual, right? They too, the employment regulation, there's a lot that they will have to change. But actually for me, the African SMEs, that you have to insert yourself in their supply chains. Walmart without, farmers, will have empty shelves in terms of, agricultural food products, yeah? Similarly, the African SMEs, you've been very good at lobbying or engaging with the multilateral corporations, right? Whether it's Microsoft, Google, these are the new guys that have come. Before that is the Unilevers and the Nestle's and the whatever. but in all of those, there are supply chains that you as SMEs have a role to play, whether on the production side, the distribution side, the aggregation side. How do you think, who was it, Coca-Cola? Remember this guy from Coca-Cola spoke at one of our conferences, and he said, how, we literally gave women bottles of Coke so that they could sell from outside of their door, from sitting outside their house. And those women then grew their businesses. They became distributors, right?
Yeah.
And they grew their businesses, educated their children, bought houses, and the rest is history. But actually I said, well, that's fine. What about the bottling of the Coke? What about the production? Actually, I don't think people should be encouraged to drink Coke. That's a bad example. But what I'm saying is, for me, it's an opportunity, post and as we're going through COVID, is to hold the corporates and big business to account as well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Parminder. I'm going to take one last question and then we're going to close. So we're a little over time at this point. So we have to try and be as concise as possible.
Okay.
But the question here is from Muna, and Muna is asking, Parminder, what are your views on the different bargaining strengths of UK versus Zambian businesses when the Zambian government may not be very reliant on SME tax revenue? How do local businesses, especially SMEs, build voice if they don't dominate government revenue? Shall I repeat that?
I don't think relationship with the government is only defined through the taxes that you pay, right? Governments are there. We're the citizens, and they have to take care of all of us, and that includes 50-60% of your people who are not in the formalized sector. So I don't agree, and I don't think I really, I also don't think it's good to compare models, right? You're talking about an old world culture you're talking about a UK which is whose institutions and tax regimes and yes, it does collect taxes, right? But yes, it collects taxes and that's what it uses. I think that's one of the biggest challenges or the opportunities, facing African governments is rapidly accelerating in the same way as accelerating digital transformation is also accelerating the formalization of the informalized sector, but it has to come with incentives, the informalized sector has to feel that they are going to get benefits from it, right? It's not just, mandatory that I must go and register my business. And so I think, that's a whole area that no doubt sort of microfinance organizations or those that are working with the informal sector will begin to look at, but also the banks, the financial services sector, that they need this in, the informalized sector to be banking, but that banking, the approach to that banking has to change. People are not going to come. It's not about bricks and mortar. It's about mobile banking, right? But also my final point is, it's like, one of the things I became aware in the program was that there's a danger that, Bongo Hive and others, the entrepreneurship support organizations, and all of those accelerator programs to educate and inform entrepreneurs with the skills, that it becomes an urban elite activity and that it's also a middle class urban elite activity, right? I think post-COVID, these programs, these initiatives, these things have to move outside of those zones, that we do have to look at the urban poor and we do have to look at the rural poor. and that no, a farmer should not have to come into Lusaka to learn entrepreneurship, business support skills, right? You know, we should take that program to where the farmers are and work with in the way that Joe Cherub did. He took his skills and he organized an entrepreneurship development program in his community with 50, 60 farmers and said, I'm going to take you from being a farmer to being a business farmer. So I think that is, you know, I mean, we have to take that in the same way as, you know, people have started to say we must have special programs for women business owners, women entrepreneurs, right? You know, they're learning the same skills, you know, actually, you know, it's the same customers and same clients, but it's just, you know, we're finding that some of them won't, you need to make special efforts to reach them. So I think it's the same, you know, for me, that is a really big opportunity, is to take this extraordinary knowledge where the people are.
Thank you, Parminder. Thank you. And on that note, Muna, I hope this answers your questions. On that note, we're going to close today's fireside chat, our very first virtual fireside chat with Parminder Vir. Just so grateful, Parminder, that you've taken the time to share some of your knowledge and your experiences with our audience, whether those that were joining us via Facebook Live and those that were joining us here on Zoom. I saw a question about how can we access this after we've been a part of this conversation, and some people said, oh, I have to leave. How can you find this? So like Parminder mentioned, we do have loads of resources on the Bongo Hive website, and alongside that, we have our webinars. So when you visit our website, you look for the on-demand section, so you'll see webinars, and apart from live and upcoming webinars, you'll be able to see the webinars that we've pre-recorded and that we've had in the past alongside this one. So you should be able to find this session, this fireside chat by tomorrow morning. So just take a look tomorrow morning and you should be able to find this fireside chat. But thank you everybody for being a part of this session. Thank you, Mwa, you're saying you've enjoyed this session. I'm glad. Thank you for taking the time to be here with us. Parminder, do you have any final words for our participants and attendees before we close?
I guess my words are really that I'm very, very hopeful, very, very inspired. You know, extremely inspired by all that I've observed, you know, in the 3 months of work, you know, just in terms of this, the campaign, just the resilience, the innovation, you know, so I'm looking forward to continuing to engage with the African SMEs, to continue to take this conversation forward, to continue to work with extraordinary individuals like yourself, Sakai, and your organization, Bongo Hive. You know, let's build a Pan-African Chamber of Commerce for SMEs.
I love that. I love that. Thank you, Parminder. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Parminder has left herself open in the sense that you can reach out to her. So if you have any questions,
no, absolutely, please do.
On social media.
Yeah, and really, you know, I mean, LinkedIn, I'm very good at this. LinkedIn, I'm very good. I will get better at Facebook, possibly at Twitter. But LinkedIn, I'm very good. At least you can find me. Yeah?
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Parminder.
We'll see you in Lusaka very soon, all right?
Yes, yes.
Take care. Love. Be good.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you,
George.
So here.
Wow. Okay. Are you leaving me? Do I? No, you have to. close it, right?
Yes.
Thank you. Wow.
George, we're going to wait on you.
He's going to let us out. Huh?
Yes.
So it's stopped recording?
Don't believe so.